Welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube, where we go behind the headlines to find out more about a story and why it matters. Protests are continuing in Iran for a sixth day, sparked by worsening economic conditions. Now, President Trump has warned Iran against killing peaceful protesters, saying the United States will come to their rescue. In a social media post, he said the US was locked and loaded and ready to go. We're joined by our Middle East correspondent, Sebastian Usher. Sebastian, what's the background to this?
I mean, essentially 1979, the Iranian Revolution is the watershed moment. Before that, the Shah had been in power for a couple of decades. The US had essentially ensured that he stayed in power, and the relations between the US and the Shah in those days were mutually beneficial as far as they were concerned, economically, politically, etc. So I mean, it was the withdrawal, in a sense, of international support for the Shah when the protests were growing in 1979 that meant that his downfall was inevitable. But as soon as the Islamic leadership in Iran took over in the Iranian Revolution, the ties between the US and Iran essentially just went through the floor. And the biggest event that really made that something that really wasn't going to change was the taking of hostages from the embassy. 55 US hostages were held for 444 days. Essentially, it destroyed the Jimmy Carter presidency. Ronald Reagan came in as president, and finally they were freed. But really, relations between the US and Iran had reached rock bottom with that. The US backed Iraq in that appalling attritional war between Iran and Iraq, which went on for years and years. There have been moments, brief moments really, when it's looked like relations have improved to some extent. There were efforts towards the end of the 90s and the 2000s. Most recently, in 2015, when the agreement was signed with the US and other Western powers to try and curb Iran's nuclear program, which the US believes, and other countries to a greater or lesser extent believe is geared towards at some point creating a nuclear bomb, a nuclear weapon. The aim of that was meant to be that the sanctions that had been in place on Iran for so long, that had caused so much damage to its economy, not the only reason, but a key reason, would be lifted. That didn't happen. And when President Trump came into power, he essentially unilaterally pulled out of that. Just add to that very briefly the way in which Iran has managed to spread its influence across the region through proxies, most famously through Hezbollah. Again, if you go back to the early years after the Iranian Revolution, the bombing of the barracks in Beirut where the Marines were stationed and the carnage that created, again, was a huge moment where the US saw Iran essentially as its enemy in the region. The US closeness to Israel means that it sees it very much in relationship to threats to Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, throughout his career, has always sold Iran as being the absolute existential threat in the region. That has been bought by many US presidents as being essentially factual. So we've seen really no end to this hostility between the two sides, and it's continuing now.
Yeah, and we've nearly reached a tipping point on a number of occasions in more recent weeks and months.
Yes. I mean, we had the 12-day war back in the summer in July. Israel, which had been building up to this for years and years, again under Benjamin Netanyahu, finally took action to try and eliminate the ability for Iran, it denies this, but for Iran to develop nuclear weapons. And President Trump stepped in with desperately needed support, essentially, for Israel to do that. So there'd been so much talk for so many years that if Israel ever did that, it would mean not that the Middle East, obviously, is any kind of a peaceful state, but it would be something which would tip it over an edge in which the possible ramifications would be incalculable. Well, President Trump went along with it, and at least for now, that's not what's happened. What we've seen is the Iranian regime weakened on many fronts. We've seen its proxies. Hezbollah took a very, very big hit from Israel when it launched its attack on its leadership, on its members a year and a bit ago now. We've seen that to some extent with the Houthis in Yemen. We've seen it with militias in Iraq that are allied to Iran. Again and again, the power that Iran has been able to exert across the region without committing itself 100% has been weakened. Add to that the absolute dire straits that the Iranian economy has been in for years, which has got worse this year.
And you mentioned those economic pressures. They have been the spark for the latest round of protests.
Yes. I mean, these protests certainly, 2025 saw the Iranian currency fall by 50% against the US dollar. I mean, it's fallen precipitously again and again, but I mean, that is unprecedented to that extent. Inflation, the most conservative estimate is it's running at over 40%, some say at 50%. So these pressures adding to the pressures from the economy that there have been for years, which have brought people out onto the streets. I mean, back in 2022, the last absolutely huge protests, they weren't originally motivated so much by the economy. They were motivated by issues of freedom, women's rights. Remember, they were named after Mahsa Amini, the young Iranian Kurdish woman who died in the custody of the police, having been taken in because of the way she was wearing her hijab. But they morphed as well into economic protests too. And again, you saw the way that the divisions within Iranian society were exposed by that as well, which both add to the intensity of a protest, but also weaken them in some ways because those different communities don't really pull together. What we're seeing in the past few days has been originally very much a protest from shopkeepers in the bazaars in Tehran. And these, you could say, are the middle class, people who have managed to navigate their way mostly through these very choppy waters of the economy, but essentially saying enough is enough. I mean, the real is changing day by day. We can't run our businesses like this anymore. This has to stop. That then moved, as it did in previous protests, to the universities, to other cities beyond Tehran. And what we've seen in the past couple of days have been in towns and villages in the west and the south. It's very difficult to tell at the moment how much momentum the protest will have. But although the Iranian regime has talked to some extent, it's tried to make a distinction between those who come out on the streets about the economy and who they see as they can have some negotiation with perhaps about that, and those who they see as wanting just to bring down the regime, in which case, if that continues and builds, we will see the same repressive measures that have been used to destroy protests previously.
Although potentially a key difference this time, the fact that President Trump has said that he will come to the rescue of protesters.
Yes, I mean, that's an extraordinary intervention. We're used to extraordinary interventions from President Trump. I mean, you might dismiss it to some extent as rhetoric, but you can't in the light of, as we were talking earlier, of the 12-day war between Israel and Iran early this year, when President Trump did, give the green light for the US to take military action that was always seen as, again, as I say, crossing a red line. I think the calculation by the US is that Iran is so weakened that although it will talk, and it has already, a senior advisor to the Supreme Leader is already talking about this is a red line. I think the sense is, though, what can they do about it? I mean, they've been shown, the authorities, unable to use their much heralded forces in the region to really make much of an impact, either on US forces or when they're attacking Israel. So, a sense that they are at bay and that some action, direct action, could be taken. I mean, what's interesting about this is how useful it is for the protesters themselves. I mean, for many of them on the streets, I don't think they would want particularly to be seen as fulfilling the narrative that the Iranian regime puts forward, which is that these are sponsored from outside. When you have President Trump saying something like that, it gives some credibility to that. So from their point of view, it may not be seen as particularly useful for what they want to do, particularly positive. And also, when a country comes under attack, as Iran did, by Israel so strongly during those 12 days, it pulls together to some extent. I think what we're seeing is the diaspora outside Iran very much applauding what President Trump has said. But they are people, many of them, who I don't think had that closer connection with the protests that are really going on. They're imagining something that is different from what it really is. They're already talking about this is the fall of a regime, it's inevitable, it's going to go down. They said that before and it hasn't happened. And I think those sorts of voices are the ones that President Trump, the people around him, maybe listen to too much. And what they say doesn't necessarily fit with what's actually going on the ground.
Thanks, Seb. Sebastian Usher, our Middle East correspondent. If you found this episode interesting, do please subscribe to us here on YouTube. You can also find out more about this story and many others in the Global News podcast. Subscribe to that wherever you get your BBC podcasts. And if you have an idea for something we should be covering on here, do please leave a message in the comments below.